Grab food and eat, or have they started?
They have not started eating, but I can invite them to.
Yeah, and then you can get started. That way.
Testing. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to FIU in Washington, D.C. My name is Gavin. I am a communications fellow here at the FIU in D.C. Center, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to our panel tonight. I will invite you throughout the panel, obviously politely, but we have some food available in the back and some drinks, so feel free to grab some now or grab some later to take home. It's totally available. I think we have enough for everybody, but if not, feel free, as I said during the panel. The way that tonight's going to work is we're going to have 3 different sections. So our first panel tonight will be on community development and economic development. And our second panel will be on national security. And then at the end, we're going to bring everybody together for a kind of wrap up and a mini Q&A session at the end. Mia, did I forget anything? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming, everybody. And I'd like to invite our first panelist up onto the board. And I will allow them to introduce themselves.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, I'm Chelsea Follett. I am managing editor of HumanProgress.org, a project of the Cato Institute, and a policy analyst in Cato's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. I was at one point named to Forbes 30 Under 30 list in the category of law and policy. I have had my writing published in various outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and others. And I have come out with my first book, Centers of Progress, 40 Cities That Changed the World. And I'm working on another book that we might get a chance to talk about as well. And I'm very excited to be here and share with you the work that we're doing at Human Progress and how it relates to this.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexis Lofton. I am actually a freshman that attends Florida International University back in Miami. Currently, I'm majoring in social work with a pre-law certificate, as I do intend on going to law school. Some things that interest me are mental health, public advocacy, and things of that nature. So I'm excited to be on the panel and talk to you guys about all of the community building services that are here and present, and maybe some that would interest all of you.
Thank you guys so much. And for those in our audience who are not a part of our DC Fly-ins, we are gathered here to celebrate 3 amazing student groups that are from FIU, which are the Black Student Union, the Alternative Breaks, yes, Alternative Breaks program as well, and the College of Law students. Thank you all for being here. So let's just dive right into the questions. And I firstly wanted to ask either of you, feel free to take your turn or not, but what examples of successful community leadership have you seen in your research, in your life, and something that inspires you and you feel like these students will be able to take home and see as inspiration in their future lives, careers, and opportunities?
I could go first. Specifically to like Miami area in Florida. I feel like Miami is a very important city that kind of welcomes various cultures and ideas. As you guys may or may not know, a lot of people who are in the Caribbean actually have learned to make Miami their home in a way where they're not afraid to kind of share their ideas and inputs into what can be created in Miami to make it a better place. And I feel like that's important in a community because you have to be willing to not only highlight your personal goals and ideas, but be willing to be open-minded and accept and understand other people's ideas because that contributes to a community. It's more than one person, it's a group, it's something that represents a body as a whole. And that's something that honestly has inspired me. I do a lot of like mental health advocacy within like Florida specifically, and it's kind of taught me to hear other people's opinions, what they may be going through, because everyone has their own like experiences, and I think with that we make a society, and without that we wouldn't really have what's been being implemented in Miami today. So, yeah.
I could not agree more with that, especially about the importance of openness and civil discourse. Now, if you do want specific heroic examples of individuals that you can look to for inspiration, I have an entire book of them I'd like to recommend to you. My former colleague Alexander Hammond wrote a book called Heroes of Progress, 65 People Who Changed the World, that goes very well with my book. They're sort of designed as a set to sit next to each other on your bookshelf. But I agree that primarily progress is about an interplay of people sharing and exchanging their ideas, engaging in that kind of discussion and debate. I think that's what really drives progress forward. There's something that Matt Ridley wrote in the foreword to my book, Centers of Progress, which is that progress is a team sport. It happens more between minds than within them. And I think that's a great insight. And that's why we see certain places at certain times in history disproportionately contribute to innovation and positive change. Because if you have the right conditions to allow people to exchange ideas, when you have that sort of openness to different sorts of people, allowing them to come in to a city and be creative together, that's something that you see over and over again when you look at history's most innovative cities, is they tend to have an unusually high degree of openness.
Thank you very much. As a follow-up question, when we talk about holistic community change, where we're bringing everybody up in our community, whether it's South Florida, whether it's the DMV, what are the aspects that you think are sometimes more often forgotten about, but maybe the most important areas to focus on when you're talking about developing your community?
That's a great question. So talking again about the commonalities that we see when we look at the places that throughout history seem to have contributed sort of the most to driving humanity forward. Openness is definitely one quality that they seem to share, but it's not the only one. Another would be freedom. And I think that a type of freedom that is often underestimated in terms of its impact on the world, its ability to drive forward positive change, would be economic freedom. And I want to give a few examples of that. I think that most people sort of intuitively understand that if you have the freedom to be entrepreneurial, to innovate, then that can lead to the sort of positive change that we see in cities like the San Francisco Bay Area during the digital revolution. It's intuitive to people how that can lead to economic growth and increase in living standards in that sense. But I don't think people realize just how many different kinds of positive change can come out of economic freedom, whether that's scientific innovation, for example. I don't think many people realize that the earliest writings of humanity were not the genealogies of kings. They were not poetry. Actually, the oldest writings that we have were accounting documents, receipts, and records of different amounts of grain that they had stored. It was accountants who created writing. I don't think many people realize that the Principia, the crowning achievement of the scientific revolution by Isaac Newton, was actually funded by the heir to a soap mogul. And then there's artistic achievement. I think many people have this idea in their heads of a starving artist as a sort of ideal, and this idea that a true artist only creates art for its own sake, with no economic reward in mind at all. But if you look at some of the places in history that have created some of the most beloved artworks that have stood the test of time, whether that's the Renaissance paintings of Florence, or the classical music of Vienna, or Kyoto, where actually the first novel was created in medieval Japan. In all of these different societies, art was made incredibly lucrative, and that drew different sorts of artists to the imperial Japanese court or the Viennese court, or into Florence, to seek out that financial patronage in order to get financial gain. But this inspired some incredible competition and innovation that has given humanity some of the most beloved artworks in history as a result. And so economic freedom would be a factor that I'd say is often overlooked.
So for me, one factor that I would say is often overlooked would be the aspect of diversity. You never want to be in a community where there's only one set viewpoint, because 9 times out of 10, a person isn't going to always have the same views as another. And for my law students in here, I guess we could tie this into like judges, for example. Nobody wants all judges who just have the same viewpoint, because they're getting different people every day in their courtrooms, right? And if we were to just say every judge has one mindset, then we wouldn't be able to really run this society in a fair way, ensuring that, it's at least somewhat equal, even though obviously the justice system has its own, things that may be, wrong with it in its own way. But I think that is something that often lacks, because without diversity, how can you ensure that everyone who's a part of that community is being heard, being seen? And I feel like tying into that diversity aspect, being willing to kind of share your ideas and opinions, even when you feel like you're not going to be heard. It took me a while when I was like in high school to kind of step out of this area where I felt like my voice doesn't matter, because all the other people are like smarter than me, they're better than me, they have all this other things that they do. And I feel like when you put yourself in that box and essentially limit yourself, you're kind of taking away from what that community could look like. So for me, it would be diversity.
Thank you very much. For my next question, we talk about economic freedom, and we talk about having a diverse group of voices, being able to influence community building and change in your own communities. But what do you see as the necessary challenges that are always involved? What are those barriers that exist from allowing, artists to be able to have a lucrative, successful career? Because to me, that seems like the end of really successful economic development, but there's a lot of road bumps in the way. And so when you're working on that, what do you need to navigate, and what do you need to be able to navigate that?
That's a great question. I'd say if you want your society to be able to fund the sorts of activities like artworks that are maybe a little higher on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that, you need your society to be wealthier, to be flourishing and succeeding in a number of ways. So I would say that that's another reason to pursue policies that do allow for the sort of prosperity to then enable all sorts of different creative endeavors. And I think that what Alexis was saying also about allowing different viewpoints to be heard is extremely important. One of the probably most important cities featured in my book in terms of changing the world would be Amsterdam during the Dutch Golden Age. And if you look at a history of global GDP per capita, the actual average income throughout history, you see that it's basically flat all the way from the time of Caesar until sometime around the Industrial Revolution, when it starts to take off. And then suddenly it grows exponentially. This has been called the hockey stick graph because it so resembles a hockey stick with this long, flat shaft and then an upward-facing blade. I don't think we realize that the vast majority of wealth that has ever been created has been created just at the sort of tail end of human history where we're living now. Throughout the vast majority of history, people lived in much the same way, doing grueling subsistence agricultural labor, and they weren't able to try to change the world through artistic expression or through all these other higher endeavors. So what changed? Well, some people, actually a great many economists, attribute that the starting point of this great change in economic growth to England and to the Netherlands. The Netherlands during the Dutch Golden Age. So why would Amsterdam, this obscure fishing village that was not particularly wealthy, not particularly well known, suddenly become the geographic center of a transformation that would completely change the way that human beings live? And there are many factors, but one of them seems to be an incredible devotion to openness and civil discourse and freedom of speech during the Dutch Golden Age. Amsterdam's presses were willing to publish both the works of Thomas Hobbes, an absolute monarchist, if you're familiar with your political theory history, and also to serve as a refuge for John Locke, the father of liberalism. These people were diametrically opposed in their beliefs about as far from each other on the political spectrum as it's possible to be, and yet both of their ideas so radical that no other press in Europe wanted to touch them. No one wanted these speakers anywhere near their countries. Both of them found that their ideas were welcomed in Amsterdam. Any viewpoint was up for debate. And it wasn't just different political philosophies that they welcomed. They also welcomed different religions. This was during Europe's wars of religion, when religious intolerance was very high. They allowed different kinds of Protestant denominations to practice their faiths. They even allowed Catholics to operate to some extent, which was unusual in a Protestant country during that time period. They welcomed in Jewish refugees. They welcomed in many different kinds of people from many different cultural backgrounds at a time when that was not common, that was unusual. And so one reason for Amsterdam's flourishing, I believe, was the society's incredible, radical degree of openness and freedom of speech.
So tying back to what you just mentioned, I guess like a necessary barrier for me would be the idea of having people who are willing to challenge like the different perspectives that are like set as the expectation. I feel it's important to challenge different viewpoints, because without that you won't have the opportunity to reevaluate what is the baseline for that like community standard. I feel like a lot of things in society, if we didn't have people who are willing to call people out or challenge them and say this is not right, or well, how can you do this if these people aren't being represented? If we don't have people who are willing to take the lead and take the stance and put their foot down essentially, then more people won't be in a way represented, but not only represented, but people's voices won't be heard in an effective way. And I feel like when you have people who are actively challenging and consistently challenging, that's when progress is done. So that to me is a necessary barrier to improve not only communities, but society as a whole.
Thank you very much for that. So my second to last question, I would say, is when you're going to try to become a community leader or an activist or a lawyer or something, as many of our students are going to become, what do you think are the most important relationships to prioritize, whether it's, you know, small nonprofits, mom and pop shops, or whether it's in a regional or even international context? What are those relationships? What are the most significant and meaningful ones that you have found that create the most, as I said before, holistic change, bringing everybody up in a community?
So for me, I feel like specifically like the law school and undergrad students, I feel like one important contact would just be everyone who you are in classes with. They essentially are the people who you'll be working with when you're a lawyer or in whatever work field. And you never know 20 years from now who can help you, who can provide you with resources to later on be successful, or if there's somewhere where you don't want to be and you see yourself progressing more. Some people in your classroom, they may be willing, if you stay in contact with them, to lend an open arm to that. Some people in my life who I kind of look towards, I had the opportunity, I'll list two people. Over the summer, I did an internship at a criminal defense firm, and I worked under, it's the lead attorney for federal law at the firm. He definitely gave me valuable insight. I feel like law is something that can definitely be a little overwhelming because there's so many people that want to do it, but not only that, there's just so many different areas and paths that you can take that it can kind of be really easy to steer off your specific track and your specific goals when you're kind of looking at every single other person but your own. And he definitely taught me to stay true to myself. I told him about my mental health stuff since it in a way ties into criminal defense. And that kind of urged me to work more with mayors. And at first I did not think that many mayors specifically like cared necessarily about what people in the younger generation have to say. I remember my first time when I went to Plantation's like city town meeting to speak about my passion project, Project Health, and everyone there was literally shocked that somebody in the younger generation was willing to speak, or the fact that they even cared that much to talk about a topic that is really pressing and should be addressed. Another contact that I feel like has been really valuable in my life, if you guys are familiar with her, her name's Hillary Cassell. She's a Florida legislator and she also is an attorney. She was super inspiring because she was diagnosed with cancer while she was in law school. And I feel like to me that she was the definition of like staying persistent and determined, because law school, I can imagine, is very, very challenging and rigorous. And the fact that she was going through something like that and continued and actually passed and got her law degree, now she's doing amazing. To me, that's, you know, you're not going to find that very easily. And because of her, I was introduced to a lot of other people. And I feel like it's who you know, but really value and stay in contact consistently with who you know, because I promise you, even if it's every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, you text them, Happy Thanksgiving, Happy Christmas, it goes a long way. And people are more willing to write letters of recommendation for you, put you in contact with other people because to them you seem more reliable. And I think that has helped me specifically.
I do not think that you can underestimate the importance of your network, not even to your own, just to your own professional success, although it's very important to that as well, but also to your ability to actually create change in the world. Again, if we look at history, whether we're talking about the marketplaces of ancient Athens or the reading societies of Edinburgh during the Scottish Enlightenment, it was when people gathered together and engaged in intense discussions and debates that they were able to come up with new philosophical ideas about how to change the government, the sorts of ideas that really changed history. As to more specific and actionable advice, I would say figure out sort of your dream organization that you'd love to work at, maybe make a list of a couple of them, and try to intern there. Try to meet people who work there. Ask someone out for coffee. People who work at nonprofits in particular tend to be very passionate about what they do and very willing to talk about their scholarship or what they're working on with interested young people. So take advantage of that and try to expand your network.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And just for my final question, I'll allow each of you to kind of plug what you see as the best opportunities for the students in the crowd to take advantage of, whether it's in their careers or at FIU itself, that you think maybe not everybody knows about.
So I'll just say I think FIU or just Miami in general take advantage of all those opportunities. I think people kind of forget of how many alumni and just FIU students have. I think majority of the people who work in Miami are either FIU alumni or U Miami alumni. And either way, they're willing to kind of pour into like the younger generation just because at one point they were in your shoes. They were looking for young minds who are willing to take that extra step to be more involved in their community. And also, I personally like the school organizations. Myself, I'm in Student Government Association. I think students should definitely be more involved in the different things that are happening in school. You'd be surprised how young, like-minded people, when they come together, can really make a change. Specifically in the school environment and how that can improve, because I'm pretty sure we all have our own things that we feel FIU can do better on or, is perfectly fine on. And I think taking the time to be in spaces that value the people who are a part of your community's voice and kind of individually each pouring into that discussion would honestly just make it better. My experience has been great, as well as just like student organizations. If you're Hispanic or if you're Caribbean, there's organizations for literally everyone, especially I know that my major is social work. There's a bunch of at least 5 social work organizations within each school. And I think that's a great way to get, that network experience we were talking about earlier with people who share the same, goals or job fields that you're interested in?
I would say try to network with people who are in fields that you're interested in, but who don't necessarily agree with you as well. Really try to foster the viewpoint diversity of your network that will sharpen your own arguments and help you practice the sort of civil discourse that, again, drives society forward. And if you are interested in interning at a think tank, I do want to recommend, although all of Cato's departments are wonderful, that one of the things I love about the humanprogress.org project, which began as an international development data bank website and then expanded to so much more with written content and videos and books and podcasts, is that we touch upon so many different policy areas, and there are so many opportunities for the young people who do intern with us. We give them the opportunity to work with AI, which is an emerging field that we're doing a lot with. We are one of the few parts of Cato that allow interns to actually publish their own written work. And almost no matter what policy area you're interested in, whether that is human rights or health or economic development and poverty or education policy and literacy and girls' education in developing countries, you have the opportunity to touch upon all of those issues and more at humanprogress.org. So I'm just going to plug my own organization for an internship.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Now I will turn it over to my colleague, but before we do that, we'd like to show a quick video in between our 2 panels. Thank you.
We are here in DC today and tomorrow to talk about South Florida's Regional Tech Hub. We were designated by the EDA as the only higher residential tech hub in the United States and the only tech hub in the state of Florida. So we want to make sure that different agencies and members of Congress learn more about our work to commercialize climate technologies from South Florida to the world.
From the FIU perspective, I know the wall of wind is one of the assets that's going to be used Rich Olson's group, and so that will be a test bed for some of the manufactured goods and stuff that we work with startup companies for. From the Institute of Environment's perspective, we are involved in the Reef Seawall project, working with UM, OnePrint, and a couple of other smaller Eco Creek companies. What the Institute brings to this is, of course, our robotics, our autonomous vehicles, our environmental sensing capabilities. And so as we place these reefs and these new seawalls in place, what my guys will do is use our autonomous vehicle capabilities to go along and basically measure their effectiveness. We've been having weekly meetings for months now, but it's always good to sit down and talk face to face.
Biggest differentiator is sustainable, resilient, and climate infrastructure. So I'm here to learn, share, and connect with different federal agencies and advocates of our tech hub.
The idea is that we have a variety of different companies, public and private institutions that already work on some of these topics to help our buildings be more efficient, to bring renewable energies to the world. But it needs some coordination, it needs the ability to kind of group all of these efforts together in order for them all to be able to succeed and grow together in one place. And we think that South Florida is a perfect place to do that.
If the South Florida Climate Tech Hub is successful in phase 2 funding, this will allow us to be the world leader in climate resilience and clean energy. This will allow us to go to other cities and other countries to say, we have something that works, we're resilient, and we're ready to scale.
And with that, we move on to the second panel. Thomas, Cassie, if you could come up, please. Now, a little FYI, that very tech hub did get designated to the point where I was actually an intern at the Department of Commerce with Economic Development Administration. So that's kind of how this panel came to be. Hope it's okay, I'm setting the scene. How economic development, which we just heard about, community building, and how that intersects with national security. Because initially, you wouldn't find that, but 3 months into a couple hours of a panel, doing our best. So I have here with me, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Thomas and Cassie, please, you can let us know what you're about.
Sure, I'll start. I'm Tommy Berry. I'm director of the Cato Institute's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies, and I'm also editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review, which is an annual publication where we collect articles by a lot of leading legal scholars and practitioners on the blockbuster cases from the previous Supreme Court term. As director of the Levy Center, I run Cato's amicus brief program, so we file friend of the court briefs from a libertarian and originalist perspective in the Supreme Court and courts of appeals, and sometimes in state Supreme Courts as well. I've had pretty much every job you can have in Cato's Constitutional Studies Department. I was an intern about 10 years ago. I was a one-year fellow my first year out of law school. I came back about 4 years ago for a permanent position, and then I was promoted to director about 6 months ago. Besides Cato, I've also worked at Pacific Legal Foundation, which similarly has a libertarian perspective but litigates as opposed to filing amicus briefs. So a lot of the big cases you might have heard of at the Supreme Court were brought by PLF. And I also clerked for a year on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals for a judge based in Jackson, Mississippi. I went to Stanford Law School where I focused on constitutional law. I was a fellow in their Constitutional Law Center, and I graduated from the Great Books program at St. John's College, which has 2 campuses in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Annapolis, Maryland, and I did some time on both campuses.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, all. My name is Cassie Heyman Shrum. I work at the Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU. Previously, we were part of the National Security Innovation Network, so I've been with DIU and SIN. You'll hear me use those acronyms a lot for about the last 3.5 years. I run our problem sourcing and curation team, so basically I get to go ask the DoD, like, what are your problems? What's happening in your world that's not being solved? And then I get to work with wonderful students like you guys at universities across the country. We help startups develop and grow. We work with students in courses. We run fellowships. And basically, we kind of take a local approach to defense innovation across the country. So that's been a lot of fun. Before that, I had a brief stint at the Department of Justice, or
Yes, DOJ, at the Board of Immigration Appeals, working in the immigration legal system, working with courts there. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you, Cassie. Really appreciate you guys. And before I was an intern, similar to my experience, I actually was also here on spring break doing a fly-in on emerging technologies. So technologies, tech hubs, here we are. So thank you for sharing your background so that way everyone can get to know you a little more. Now, jumping right into the panel, and feel free to go back and forth, consider it a conversation. In what ways does economic development intersect with your current role?
So I can start there. So with the Defense Innovation Unit, we work really hard to get a better sense of what's happening in local communities and really have a community-centric approach to helping support startups, helping support entrepreneurs, and really kind of cultivating student minds. I think, we found over and over again that national security, they say that DoD is the largest bureaucracy in the world, and it is. And a lot of that is, you're really in a war situation. You need to think and act in one way, but I think that leads to some challenges sometimes with thinking outside the box, and that's where all of your brilliant minds come in. We find time and time again that when there's a problem set, and we bring it to kind of the next round of great minds who have been studying their fields for the last 3 or 4 years or want to put their minds towards something, that they come up with solutions that blow people's minds constantly, and people are like, oh my gosh, these are the university students, they did this, and we're like, yes, they are brilliant. And so by helping support local communities, by helping students build startups, by helping you guys follow your passions and make an impact in national security, not only are we able to kind of grow funding for, not just Lockheed Martin and those kind of large companies you hear, but help students build startups, bring that kind of economic growth to their local communities, work in their spaces, and support national security in ways that maybe they wouldn't have thought of before. And so it's a lot of fun, and we get to do that. So I would say that's kind of the main intersection there for me.
Sure. From our perspective in our center, one of our strong views is that private property rights are critical to economic development and to free markets in general. So we file many briefs on the issue of takings. The Constitution has a so-called takings clause, which suggests that in some cases, states or the federal government can take private property for public use. The classic case is if they need to build a highway, for example, and someone's house is in the way, they can pay fair market value and force you to sell it for the sake of the public good. The issue is a lot of states, in our view, have abused this, taken private property essentially for other private uses. The most infamous was a case that went up to the Supreme Court called Kelo versus City of New London, Connecticut in 2004, where a woman's home and several people's homes were taken to give to the Pfizer Corporation to build a plant. The plan, at least, was to build a plant, and the justification was it was a public use because the plant would create more tax revenue, and that would go towards economic development. So our view is that private property is best put towards its best use when its owners get to decide how to use it, and when owners only sell when they are offered a price at which they are willing to sell, not an abstract notion of what the government thinks is fair market value. In our view, we saw this, in fact, in the Kelo case. The lots ended up lying vacant because Pfizer, in fact, was not as developed in its plans to build that plant as they claimed they were when they were trying to get the taking, the eminent domain. So one of our projects is to get that case overruled. We just recently filed an amicus brief urging the court to overrule it, and we similarly file amicus briefs in other situations where we think the right to control your own property has been abused, whether that's takings for private industry or takings that reduce, for example, people's ability to rent at the price they want to. New York has very stringent laws that essentially prevent you from evicting people even if they stop paying your rent, which we think is violating the rights of the owners to use it as they wish. So that's one of the most frequent economic issues that comes up for us.
Wow, thank you for the fascinating answers, guys, really. So this next question is kind of like a two-part where it's individually addressed to both of you. So I'll start with Cassie. how would you say that your work in problem solving and curation improves national security? This may seem like pretty blunt, but we want to see like how your role improves it for the better, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, one of my favorite parts of my job is I get to go to different bases and like talk to people who, you know, in the military, there's a hierarchy, right? You have a command. And so when you're up at that kind of 4-star level, you're looking at things from a really strategic point of view, right? And there's a lot of value to that. Don't get me wrong. Like there's a reason that we have strategic thinkers, but there's also all these folks who are kind of on the ground doing tactical stuff. And they're seeing the day to day and they're seeing these Humvees, the handle on the door falls off all the time. And then we can't use the Humvee because we can't get into the Humvee. So you're like, well, why don't we solve that? That seems like a really easy problem to solve. But at that 4-star level, strategically, you're not thinking about that. They're not like, yeah, the door's on the Humvees. They're like, well, this is how we operate. Here's the bigger picture. And so by, you know, getting to understand what's happening at that tactical level across the DoD, we're able to kind of serve as a front door for those problems. And so we can bring those up to the 4 stars and say, hey, aggregate demand says that this is a consistent issue. We're also able to look at those larger issues that they're facing at those tactical levels and kind of find different ways to innovatively think about them. And so by serving as kind of an on-ramp, both for those problems that you think are too small and those problems that you think are too big, we kind of get to meet them in the middle and really curate them and really get a sense of like, you know, a lot of times you'll see similarities, right? You don't think they're similar, and then it's like, well, actually, this relates to the supply chain and things like that. So by bringing in problems, by bringing awareness and connection to smaller and larger problems, we really get to address different facets of national security that you don't necessarily see on the day-to-day in the news. And then additionally, when we curate problems well, and we make sure, right, sometimes when you get a problem set, it's not actually a problem, right? It's a solution masquerading as a problem. And you don't really know like what is the core issue here. And so by really curating these problems and by working to make sure we really understand what the core issue is, we're able to move really quickly once we figure that out. So if we spend the time ahead of time to say, what is the problem? And like, you know, is it this thing that we think it is, or is that just a symptom of the problem? By kind of getting to the core of that, we're really able to attack what the issue is at its core and kind of work from there. So I think it's a lot of fun. I get to do a lot of like brain puzzles pretty much every day, which is my favorite part of my job. So I think that's how we serve national security, is we're able to attack those problems that maybe aren't being addressed other places.
Gotta fix those Humvees. Very important.
Gotta fix
Very
the
important.
Humvees.
So now, Tommy, is that you? Yeah. Awesome. Okay, great to hear it. So keeping Cassie's impact in mind, because impact matters, what is the legal impact of national security on local communities? We can even tie in how AI is changing the nature of billable hours. You know, that's something that I feel like a lot of lawyers to be would like to hear about. So take it away.
Well, you know, it's a tricky question, because if you asked a lot of people in government, they'd probably say that Cato is more a thorn in the side of their attempts to advance national security. But my view is I don't think that's true. I don't think that there's as much of a tension between civil liberties and national security as some people might claim there is. So when Cato files amicus briefs, we're almost always on the opposite side of the government. I'll give a recent example, which was the TikTok case that was fast-tracked up to the Supreme Court. The government claimed national security and data privacy concerns justified a law that essentially banned a speech platform that 170 million Americans were using. In my view, and in the view of my colleagues, this had serious First Amendment problems, most importantly that it wasn't narrowly targeted enough at their claimed interest, which was essentially loss of classified data. So for example, they didn't consider, or they didn't end up implementing more targeted rules, like just banning it on government employees' phones. Why did they need to ban it on every single American's phone? So as civil libertarians and as people who either sue the government or support suing the government, the case we're frequently making is that national security can and should be compatible and harmonious with individual rights, and that in fact holding the government's feet to the fire and requiring national security projects to be narrowly and specifically tailored ends up improving the best practices for them. It forces them to think carefully about what is the specific goal they have in mind and what's the most targeted and direct way to do it with the least impact and collateral damage on speech rights, on privacy, on liberties in general. So in my view, the Supreme Court is often too deferential to the executive branch, particularly when national security is invoked, but it's important to at least make them think about that. Another example is reform of the FISA court. This is the court that essentially reviews the government's claims when they're asking for a secret warrant that's so secret they can't even tell the general public or the people being searched that the warrant exists, which means that the arguments are one-sided. So Cato has advocated for advocates to be on the other side of that and argue against the warrant. And again, in my view, that's not against national security. That's just forcing them to think carefully and only impose these warrants when they're absolutely necessary and when judges have heard both sides of the argument. In terms of, AI is an incredibly powerful tool that we're still figuring out. At Cato, we're still figuring out to what extent should we be using this in our own briefs. There's obviously concerns that it does things like make up cases. This is definitely going to change the legal practice going forward, but I'm not concerned, as some people are, that it's going to put lawyers out of business in any field, because ultimately lawyering is not about having an encyclopedic memory of cases. It's about novel questions. And what I particularly like about our job is because we're filing at the highest courts in the federal government, every question we work on is novel. It's not just about applying bright line rules that have already been settled. Computers might be able to do that, but they're never going to be arguing at the Supreme Court.
Amen to that. I don't know about you guys, but my brain physically expanded in like the past 5 minutes. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about what you guys do, honestly, on a day-to-day. Now for the final question. Within both of your respective fields, what are some up-and-coming economic initiatives that are beneficial to national security, and how can students help in these initiatives so that way they can develop their communities to become more secure and resilient?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of the work that we do is to encourage students to create small businesses and to help them navigate the Department of Defense. It's often seen as kind of a black box, right? It's like, I don't know how I would ever get a contract with them. Those go to Lockheed, those go to Booz, those, they're not things that we can do. And we work really hard to create inroads, right? We think that we need new and creative thoughts in the Department of Defense. And so if you are entrepreneurial and you're like, I want to start a business, or if you want to look into policies that you're like, I don't think that makes sense, right? Or I'm curious about that. Basically we want to be kind of that front door. We want to help you come into the DoD and change things up and make a difference. And so by starting a small business, by taking a capstone and working on a national security problem set, put your brain to work on that. And I think that you'll see pretty quickly ways that you can make changes. And so, I guess the economic tie-in there is if you want to start a small business, if you want to join a venture, if you want to, kind of do those things, that can bring money into your community, and that's a really strong economic pull. But also by looking at policies and working on, I know we have a lot of lawyers in the room, so that's where our policy heavy work starts. But if you are in engineering, if you are in psychology, if you think, hey, that could be interesting, there's so many places where you can make an impact that you probably don't even think. We had a project a couple years ago on soldier feeding. And so they were trying to create the best way for soldiers to be fed, right, in the theater. And we had two separate groups. We had one that was focused on food sciences, and then one that was a psychology group. And they were doing testing. So every couple weeks they'd have students come in and sign all the waivers and all that. But then they got to taste the different food bars that the other group was making and say, is the mouthfeel of this right? Is the texture of this right? And then, based on the changes there, we see kind of the economic windfall of the supply chain and how things are being manufactured and where they're being manufactured. So I think everything you do has some economic impact. But I think if you think towards national security, it's broader than just like, fighting a war or anything like that. There's national security is a broad field. And so I think, in any way that you're curious and interested, and just by being here for these fly-ins, I think you're curious and interested in the world. I think be passionate in what you do, and you're going to be able to create economic impact and impact national security.
One important issue area for economic development we work on frequently is pushing back against protectionism, which is often at the local government level. You'll see laws, for example, at PLF, we frequently sued laws that banned food trucks, for example, that said you had to be a brick and mortar building to sell food. And when push came to shove and you asked, why was this law passed, it was by lobbying from the existing restaurants who didn't want the competition. They'd sometimes put a fig leaf of a justification of safety, but when you looked at the facts, there was no evidence that food trucks were any more dangerous or had any more food safety complaints than brick and mortar restaurants. So there is a legal movement to use the Constitution to push back and strike down protectionist laws like that. The 14th Amendment, in our view, not everyone agrees with us, but in our view, it protects the right to earn a living and a basic economic liberty to apply one's trade without meaningless and unjustified regulations. Another example of these laws are so-called certificate of need laws, which, believe it or not, force you to prove to the government that your new business is going to be needed in the economy before you can open it. A free market economist might say the test for whether it's needed is whether people buy it after you open it, and you find out that way. But that's not what some local governments think. They think they get to decide whether your business is going to be needed. And once again, when you dig into these, usually the people who push for certificate need laws are the ones who already have businesses that have been grandfathered in and that don't want the additional competition of new businesses opening up. And this has applied everything across the gamut from daycares to midwives to trash collectors and so forth. So in our view, more small businesses would be able to start if these types of laws were struck down, and if you're a lawyer, supporting the litigation, challenging them, coming up with creative arguments, constitutional or otherwise, to challenge them, or if you're not a lawyer, being willing to be a plaintiff, being willing to be the named plaintiff challenging these laws. It's a big sacrifice because it means you have a target on your back, and we've seen governments retaliate on people who are willing to step forward and say, this isn't right. When I was at PLF, I saw how hard it was to convince people to be a named plaintiff in these types of challenges. But in my view, it's necessary and somewhat heroic for people to be willing to step forward and be the public face of challenges to these laws. And they help not just themselves, but everyone else in the same business.
Thank you so much for those well-rounded answers, guys. Give them a round of applause, really briefly. Thank you. Now, sit tight, because we're going to have a reflective panel afterwards. Everyone will come together, but a quick transition. For context, we've hit one federal priority so far, environmental resilience with our tech hub, but we are now missing, health. Health is important, but here. But we now are advancing on the Western Hemisphere and the Americas, and that touches exactly what we discussed just now. Let me put it over here so that way y'all are comfortable. This is one of our past Hamilton Scholars. I was a Hamilton Scholar, once won, always won. And what she was able to do in terms of advancing this specific federal priority.
Hi, my name is Bella Urbina. I'm a senior at Florida International University, and I'm a Hamilton Scholar here in Washington, D.C. So I'm a research intern at the American Foreign Policy Council, and while I've been at the American Foreign Policy Council, I've been doing things such as contributing to the China policy briefs. I was working on researching the United States' new economic corridor within the Middle East and India. I'm also starting to begin policy briefings on Morocco. A couple of things that I hope to accomplish are: one, publish an article on Chinese fentanyl trafficking in Latin America and how that affects everyday U.S. citizens, and two, to publish an op-ed on Chinese influence in the lithium triangle in South America and how the U.S. can combat that. This ties into what I'm doing as a Hamilton Scholar here in D.C. We were able to present the dashboard of Chinese activities to politicians, to federal agency representatives, and to everyday citizens here at the FIU DC Hub. So this is a Security Research Hub lithium mining dashboard. So what you can do is you can go anywhere on the map. The lithium triangle ranges between Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. You can zoom in, you can move the map around, and you can go over here, you can pick any project that you want. For example, let's click on the Phoenix project. So once you click on the project, it zooms into where it is on the map, exactly what location it's in. This one's in Argentina, and it gives you all the details. For example, the name of the project, what company is producing this project, the secondary company, and what country is leading this project. The defining moment that attracted me to Washington, D.C. is when I attended the D.C. Fly-In in spring of 2022. It was based around Latin America and the Caribbean, and while being here, I was able to meet with a bunch of organizations, nonprofits, world banks, and we were able to talk about the most pressing issues surrounding Latin America. Also, I was able to go to Marco Rubio's office and lobby his staff on increasing more funding towards FIU's research initiatives. So while being here in DC, being a Hamilton Scholar, and also being a research intern at AFPC, I'm also in the Honors College. I'm taking 7 classes. I'm graduating this semester. I'm a dancer, and I'm also doing another internship on the side. And the quote that I've been telling myself throughout the semester is short-term pain for long-term gain. Throughout the entire time that FIU, Safe the School of International Public Affairs has been immense help to me, because no matter which door I turn, there was always a faculty member ready to help me, ready to watch me succeed within my academic and professional career.
All right, well, thank you everybody for attending our panel. We'd like to close it out with a few final questions to all 4 of our panelists, and then we'll allow a little bit of time for
Q&A.
any audience questions.
Alrighty then. So we're going to ask 2 questions because we already did this one.
Yeah.
The first one, for those of you who know, this is my little drag race moment. What advice would you give to little you now that you're at this stage in life? Anyone? Go for it.
I'll go first because I still consider myself pretty little. But if I can speak to my middle school or high school self, I would just tell myself to kind of fail forward. If a challenge or something arises and it doesn't go the way that I necessarily want it to, use that as more of a catalyst to push me to either fight stronger or continue to go ahead and progress. I feel like a lot of times it's easy to get caught up in the moment when something doesn't necessarily go your way or looks like it's not continuing to progress. And honestly, I did that when I was younger a lot myself. But I would definitely tell myself to use those opportunities as more of a learning experience and learn how to better take those situations and use it to my advantage.
I'd say trust your gut about whether you're enjoying and self-motivated in a job or a pursuit. You're not going to end up lasting long or being successful in a job where you have to drag yourself out of bed in the morning every day and where it really feels like work. You don't feel like you're getting satisfaction inherently from it besides the paycheck. So I kind of came to Cato almost by process of elimination of the vast majority of legal jobs I knew I would have been miserable at as I researched them, talked to people who are in big law and said that's definitely not for me, and same with trial work and lots of other things. So in the long run, what matters way more than salary or external titles or prestige or whatever is your day-to-day work basically pleasant and self-motivating and doesn't feel like work most of the time. Mm-hmm. So prioritize that above anything else, and don't be afraid to shift quickly when you're not feeling that in a current job, because inertia is a more powerful force than you think. And I have lots of law school classmates who have been in jobs they don't like for 5-6 years just out of inertia.
I think echoing those sentiments, I think, find something that you're passionate in, and work on that. Will still be days where you're like, oh my gosh, I have to respond to 100 emails or all of that. But it makes, the wins are worth it more. And then also, I think specifically as a woman in any career field, like, you are qualified. A lot of times women, there's statistical, you look at statistics and it's like women don't go for jobs until they're like super overqualified, where, statistically men apply for jobs that they are less qualified for but are very confident about. And that's not, I don't think that's anyone in this room. I just mean statistically in general. So I would say, if you're interested in the job and you're passionate, like, go for it. The worst thing they can say is no, but the best thing that could happen is you get a really cool opportunity that you wouldn't have gotten before. So go for that.
My advice echoes all of that. And more specifically, if I were talking to my younger self, well, right after college, I went to William & Mary. I double majored in government and English. I went to graduate school at the University of Virginia, where I was in foreign affairs. And initially, my major was political theory. But I looked at the statistics on hiring with that degree and realized I would never get a job anywhere near that field. It was not marketable. And so I switched my major from political theory to international relations, which was also under the foreign affairs rubric and seemed to me like probably the most marketable of all the options I had, and just had a political theory minor. If I could go back, I would say, you don't have to switch. I know that it doesn't seem like the most marketable thing, but actually, it's really hard to predict the market. And something that you're interested in and passionate about, like Tommy was saying, that's ultimately hard to put a price tag on. So now I have actually somehow ended up working in a field that is basically political theory and history and international development, all the things I was really interested in graduate school. So follow your interests. I know that sounds very cliche and doesn't sound very practical, but it can work out better than you'd think, or at least in the case of my younger self. That's what I would say.
And if I can add to that, like, I know so few people who are doing exactly what they were doing in undergrad in their career. Like, someone on my team, she was a dance major, and then she got her master's in emerging technology in defense, and like now we do the same thing. Which I also went to William and Mary, and I got my major. Yeah, go Tribe. Sorry, wrong school, but like I got my major in international relations and psychology, and we've ended up in the exact same place. So like, your major doesn't define you. It's your skills and it's your passion.
Love it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And for our final question, before if anybody wants to ask any of their own, you're a student, so maybe this applies to you now, but for everyone else, how have you and how can you, in specific actionable items, get young people motivated in community building and getting involved, maybe not just in your field, but in whatever their fields might be in the audience, to get other young people motivated?
So
yeah.
true. Take your time. It's a big one.
I can start. It's going to be a bit of a plug. I'm so sorry. But with the Defense Innovation Unit, we really work hard to make sure that we are sourcing problems. I work hard to make sure we are sourcing problems. It's not just general. It's like literally me, to make sure that the problems we're getting are real world problems that have an effect. And if that's something you want, like, please let us know. We work with university students. You guys are like the best part of my day is when I get to work with university students, because you guys have just the best ideas and you're so smart. So if you want to get involved in real world problems and have an impact, let us know. I can give anyone my email. But Florida's our largest ecosystem. Our Southeast Regional Director is like one of the most powerful people I've ever met. She's awesome. And she's so cool.
We
So-
love her.
Yeah. Well, yeah, she's phenomenal. She's like my favorite. So, like you are in a hotbed of economic growth, of innovation, of national security, and like you're clearly already, engaged and involved. So if you're interested in any kind of projects that, have real world impact that you can do while you're in your undergrad, if you're interested in fellowships, if you're interested in starting a business, let us know, because once you get started, it's like a domino effect and other people are like, wow, that's really cool. You're, impacting real world things. You're briefing generals at Southcom. Like, that's super cool. And then that's kind of it dominoes. And you can have an impact where you are right now. And then also just get involved at your school. If defense is not for you, which is so fine, like get involved and make a difference in the area that you're passionate in.
I completely agree with that. I think just pushing back against some cynicism or sort of careerism for just the sake of getting established and not the sake of making change or finding something you're passionate about is so important. That's what I'm most dismayed to see if I find college students who are basically, just think that the point of a higher education is to like secure yourself economically and have given up on hope of finding something they're passionate about or something that it's going to make changes that they can feel good about. So that's partially the great books, liberal arts major in me. I had to, a lot of people have to convince their parents that it's a good idea to go to a school with no real majors and no real training for any specific jobs. But in the long run, education and finding ideas that resonate with you is important, even if you can't see the immediate careerist goals for that, because it helps you, again, develop towards the long-term most important goal, which is figuring out what resonates with you. And I'll say for anyone who resonated with the type of stuff I was talking about, supporting legal challenges from a broadly libertarian perspective, one of the internship departments at Cato. Chelsea and I can fight about which the best department is, but in my view, it's the Center for Constitutional Studies. So if any of you are current law students or going to be law students, we hire current law students all 3 semesters, spring, summer, fall. So you can apply. Connor, who's here, is one of our intern coordinators, Connor Fogarty. And if any of you are graduating or going to be graduating, there's Connor. If you're 3Ls who are going to be graduating, we're still hiring for this year to start summer 2025 for a year-long legal associate position, which, as I mentioned, was my first job out of law school. And you would be taking the lead on writing the amicus briefs filed in the Supreme Court directly out of law school, which I don't think I'm not aware of any other job that can promise you that.
So for me, I actually think the question is very interesting because being a part of like the younger generation and kind of like seeing how we deal with like certain challenges that are present specifically like in today's age, I feel like it's not necessarily that we're uneducated, just that we're not like passionate enough to want to do something to like fight and want better for ourselves. And I think it's always been a question in myself, like what can I do to make people my age, want better for not only the younger generation, but the current state of the world that affects everyone. And I think that just comes with like being persistent and trying to educate specifically those in the younger generation who may not feel like action is needed right now. Because I think that just like plays a role in like, even though we may be educated, that persistence and continuously reminding, hey, this is happening right now. What are we going to do about it? I think when we continue to ask those questions, we become more determined to want change.
I think just by voluntarily being here in this room, listening to this when you have many other uses of your time that you could be engaging with instead proves that everyone here cares a lot. You are very engaged, and I'd say continue to lead by example on that. That's one way to fight cynicism. Just be the shining beacon of someone who cares and wants to change the world and is passionate about whatever your policy area is, whether it's defense or environmental policy, whether it's the law. Just keep following that passion. As far as trying to get other people on board, with that. Also, don't be afraid of discussion and debate. I think that, especially with political issues, it can be hard to want to engage at all. And if you're meeting someone who is very cynical and basically doesn't believe that it's worth it to try to do anything besides just, keep your head down, not change the world, try to look out for yourself. That's about the most you can hope for. When you encounter that, maybe do engage in a discussion. There are respectful civil discourse type ways you can do that. There are some great models for how to do that from Cato's Sphere project, which is another project I love, where they model respectful conversations across vast political differences. But yeah, also talk to Connor if you're at all interested in changing the world. I know as a think tank employee, I'm very much biased in favor of the thought that ideas can change the world, but I do believe that, and we have many great departments. If you're a law student, I think it's obvious you should work with Tommy. If you're not, well, Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity lets you focus on any area of the world or region that you're passionate about. Humanprogress.org, again, lets you focus on all sorts of different areas. And whatever department you end up at a think tank, at least at Cato, you're often able to do voluntary work for scholars in other departments as well, or just stop by their office and talk about what they're working on and learn so much from those conversations and make important connections that can help you in your career as you're trying to figure out what it is that you're passionate about, what exactly you want to do, how can you combine your interests that might seem like they have any, market role for them. So yeah, I would again encourage people to talk to Connor about that.
Thank you, Chelsea, Cassie, Tommy, and Alexis for your time. We are going to do a quick transition so that way you all can process everything that we've, provided here. And then we're going to do a QA for anyone.